start us off?
Sure. Are narcolepsy and Tourette's and OCD symptoms and expressions considered seizures? I don't think so. Unless sometimes these disorders can have additional disorders, so they can have additional seizures, but the symptoms themselves, I don't think are considered seizures. Narcolepsy and Tourette's and OCD symptoms or expressions considered seizures. So these are different neurological disorders, and the symptoms of those are not necessarily considered seizures themselves. And so this person had multiple questions. Lobotomies, still common practice. So that's a practice where you take out parts of the brains, especially in the past, like the front part of the brain, to control for something that is not in practice, right?
So yeah, in special circumstances, we do brain surgery for epilepsy, and there are very specific criteria that would make someone a candidate for brain surgery. A complete lobectomy would not be tremendously common, but sometimes if there's a large area of the brain involved, we can do a surgery that will remove an entire lobe, and the most dramatic surgery that we do will actually disconnect and or remove an entire hemisphere. We call that hemispherectomy, which is an even more small subset of patients who would be candidates for that. We would never do brain surgery or consider brain surgery in someone whose seizures are controlled with medication. So only in a situation where patients have tried quite a few medications, the seizures are still very problematic and having a big impact, and in a situation where we're certain that surgery has a high likelihood of making a big difference in improving the control of the seizures. So at Dell Children's Hospital, we have a big epilepsy surgery program, and last year we did somewhere between 50 and 60 brain surgeries for seizure disorders. Our hope in those situations is to actually cure epilepsy, and we don't get a cure every time. Sometimes we are just palliating. Sometimes we're just trying to take away the worst part of the epilepsy and trying to mitigate the severity of the seizures. So sometimes cure is not possible, but you can still make a big impact on quality of life.
Are there specific brain areas where you attach EEG electrodes, like depending on what you're looking for? So generally, the general EEG, there's, I think the latest one, there's a cap that you wear, and then it has multiple electrodes all go around. But I imagine in specific situations, you will just place electrodes in certain areas of the brain, correct?
Yes, so there's a very standard setup for how electrodes are arranged for an EEG, and when they do it in mice, there's probably a standard mice setup.
Yeah, there's two. It's real, one in front and one in back. Mice are really easy, or small.
So most of the time in adults, we use somewhere between 16 and 20 electrodes, and you can add additional ones and make them kind of closer together to get more specific information.
Okay, so the final question from this person: what other methods besides drugs being used to treat epilepsy?
So we talked about surgery, and that's one possibility. There is another question on another card about dietary therapies for epilepsy. And we also have a very big dietary program at Dell Children's Hospital. We have probably 60 or 70 patients who use dietary therapy. And the standard dietary therapy for epilepsy is called the ketogenic diet. And 40 or 50 years ago when the ketogenic diet was new, it was the ketogenic diet. Now there are lots of ketogenic diets, like paleo diets and modified Atkins and South Beach, and all of those things promote ketosis. The ketogenic diet that we use for epilepsy is very, very strict. We don't really understand why that helps to lessen seizures, but it can be very, very effective. It's a hard diet to follow. You have to be 100% willing to do it all the time, and that's not an easy thing to do every single day. But in some cases, when medicines don't work, it's a really good alternative. We use it frequently. We especially are prone to use it when we have a patient who's being fed by a G-tube and has formula for treatment. It's a lot easier to do the diet that way. But we do it in patients who have regular day-to-day diets too. They just have to make very different food choices. Other than that, there are several devices that can be used that are surgically implanted devices that stimulate different areas with electrical stimulation. There's one that stimulates the vagus nerve. There is a responsive neural stimulator where the electrodes are actually implanted in the brain trying to target the area where the seizures occur. That's very relatively rarely used because it's relatively new. And then actually just last week, the FDA approved deep brain stimulators for the treatment of epilepsy, and the deep brain stimulator has been more widely known for the treatment of Parkinson's disease and tremor, but it's also shown to be helpful for seizure reduction. So those are other ways that we treat epilepsy.
All right, so I have a few questions here on genetics that we can tackle. So the first is to please elaborate on epilepsy genes. And that is kind of what I mean by that are genes that have been identified in people where there is a mutation that causes epilepsy. So an epilepsy gene is, a gene that all of us have, but that when it's disrupted in a certain way, it can lead to epilepsy. And then there are a couple of examples related to that. There's a gene called DEP-DC5 that can lead to an epilepsy, and there are a couple of questions about that. And so first are what sorts of research is being done into that specific gene at UT? None that I know of, but that isn't to say that we won't expand. So another question here is my lab open to studying other rare genetic syndromes in epilepsy? And so that is kind of the main focus of my lab is rare genetic epilepsies. And whether I will be able to expand beyond the ones that I currently study, the hope is always yes. It's that I don't actually engineer these mice myself, and so there's always kind of we're always waiting and hoping that someone can help produce these mice that then we can do our electrophysiological studies. So these different mutations are things that we hope to look into in the future, but right now the thing that my lab focuses on are two specific genes that cause what's called Dravet syndrome, which is an early pediatric epilepsy, but there are a lot of others that we hope to get to and hope to understand more of. And if you have specific questions about those, feel free to come ask me. But then this question kind of relates back to you is about mTOR inhibitors. And do you know much about mTOR inhibitors and drugs that work on that pathway?
So that's a really interesting question. So I actually am part of a clinic program at Dell Children's that works with a group of patients with epilepsy. Not everybody has epilepsy, but there's a genetic disease called tuberous sclerosis, which affects people in a lot of different ways. It can affect other things besides the brain, but the brain is especially prone to being affected, and it often causes seizures. It can also cause autism. It can affect the heart and the liver and the kidneys and the skin, all of those things. It turns out that tuberous sclerosis is caused by a mutation in two different genes that are essential to the mTOR pathway. So the mTOR stands for mammalian target of rapamycin. Rapamycin is an antibiotic, okay? So we discover antibiotics in lots of different ways, but antibiotics generally have an impact on bacteria. That's why we like to use them. But sometimes antibiotics also have effects on animal cells or human cells. And so the mammalian target, which would include humans, of rapamycin, which was designed to treat bacteria, is this enzyme complex of lots and lots of different proteins that together have an impact on cell reproduction. And when that signaling pathway is broken, then you can't regulate cell reproduction very much, and you're prone to improper development or overdevelopment of certain tissues. And that's why you can get different kinds of tumors that can grow over time, or tissues that formed improperly, and even though they don't grow, they don't work properly, so they can interfere with function, or they can cause their own problems, like causing seizures. So that's tuberous sclerosis. That's what the mTOR pathway is all about. Well, now that the mTOR pathway has been worked out, which has been understood a lot because of the discovery of the genes that cause tuberous sclerosis, it turns out that there are loads of disorders that can cause problems with the skin and the brain and development and epilepsy, and they all kind of hone in on the cascade of proteins that are part of the mTOR signaling pathway. So it's a pretty exciting field of study because it offers some different ways to treat the actual disease that's causing the epilepsy, as opposed to just treating the seizures themselves. And that's not limited to tuberous sclerosis. It's limited to other disease processes that are involved in that signaling pathway. And it might even be relevant to some types of epilepsy that we don't know to be related to the mTOR pathway. So there's a lot of promise in that area, and there's been enormous progress in that area in the span of about 15 years since those TS genes were discovered. It's not a very long period of time to have worked out all of that complex stuff, thanks to the scientists who do work on mice.
So to just sort of follow up on that, it's not directly related, but one of the questions was how precise can current therapeutic drug target, or how specific is it currently in the future, and also specific to region of brain. So not just for epilepsy, but for a lot of neurological disorders and brain disease, one of the future directions that a lot of us are thinking is how specific can we target. So seizures, some of the seizures, we don't know where they originate from, what brain area it starts from, so this will be a little difficult. But in certain disorders, we know that specific brain area is being targeted. But as this person asked, a lot of medications that we take basically influence entire brain function. And sometimes that's why we get negative side effects, and it doesn't only affect our nervous system, but it can also affect our body. So the future of drug treatment, one pathway is how can we target specific brain area for the drug to, for instance, just to influence. And I don't think we are there yet when it comes to drug treatment. For some brain stimulation, and those things we can target a little more specifically, but in terms of drug treatment, we are working on it.
So I have a good question here, which is how do I determine in the lab if my mice have epilepsy? And in a way, it's kind of surprising, in a very similar way that we would with a human patient. So we do EEG on mice. It is not, as elaborate. It really just takes a couple of electrodes, but we can do continuous 24-hour EEG and video monitoring of mice, which I have not yet set up in the lab, but it's something that I've done a lot in the past. And mice exhibit seizures in very similar ways that humans do. You can see behavioral seizures and you can see EEG seizures. So we do a lot of the similar things. And the advantage of using mice is that we can then do tests on their brains that we can't otherwise do on human patients.
Since we're talking about EEG, one of the questions, I actually don't have an answer for it. So I don't use EEG myself. So the question was, when were EEGs first developed and used? And how have they evolved? So I don't know when they were developed. Do you?
In the 1920s, by a German scientist named Berger, is the last name, and he was very essential in describing some of the fundamental normal findings of brain activity, electrical activity from EEG recordings, and how it has evolved. I would say, so technologically, the evolution that has had the biggest impact in my career is the transformation from pen and ink scribbles to digital recording, and that's transformative in many, many ways, but we can do all kinds of manipulation on the screen to be able to look at it differently and analyze different things and not have to turn pages and not have to carry stacks of paper that are this big. And so that's been a major difference. And then intracranial monitoring is also a major factor that has changed over time, and intracranial monitoring with electrodes that are placed onto the surface of the brain or into the brain itself with a depth electrode is something that we use in surgery to better define exactly what area needs to be removed. That has been much more recent than the 1920s. Probably in the 1940s or 50s is when that was first being experimented with, and it's used quite routinely in brain surgery. And there was one other point I wanted to make, and I forget what it was. That's enough.
So there's a question about acupuncture. So this is not directly related to epilepsy, but does electrostimulation in acupuncture treatment for pain management change the electrical activity of the brain cells? So my understanding is that where the acupuncture is usually, I guess you can do it on the scalp also, but what I've seen is usually sort of the body parts, and especially, for example, if you have joint pains or back pains, either the focal point will go to those areas, and those are usually sort of where the electrical signals go through. So if you have what we call pinched nerves, it might relieve some of the pressure from there. And one way is sort of let the electrical signal flow better. But another thing, my understanding is that it also allows the blood to flow better. But you can tell that I'm just making this up because I actually don't know much about acupuncture. So if you guys know more about it.
So I wouldn't say that I know a lot more about it, but I can tell you that it's probably akin to some of the mechanisms that electrical stimulation can impact seizures, because you are stimulating those sensory tracts. And by sending signals in, when those sensory inputs are processed within the brain, that probably has some downstream effects on the perception of pain at the level of the brain. So you are stimulating the body very far away, but the way that relieves pain probably is happening in the cortex and not at the level of the place that you're sticking the needles in.
So I have a question here about if the brain cells have salt solutions, why do we go for sugar to replenish energy? And this is a really interesting interaction between basically the things that we take into our body. So the salt solutions are the things that our cells are using to produce these signals. But the really interesting thing is that a huge proportion of the energy that we consume and use, the reason that we take in sugar, is actually because our brains use up a huge amount of that sugar to transport the salt around. So as I showed in a slide of a little box on the side of a cell membrane moving a chloride into that cell, that movement of ions and that replenishment of each individual cell's battery is one of the most energy consuming things that happens in our body. And so this really uses up, that's why the brain uses up a huge proportion of the energy that we take in. And so we use the sugar as an energy source to charge up the batteries in our cells. And that's how those things are related. So it's actually a really interesting and insightful question.
So I have 3 different questions that essentially address the same thing, which I think is really cool that 3 different people had the same thoughts about this. And not to read each one, they're very similar, but how do you pinpoint what the cause of the problem is in terms of whether it's an electrical signal problem, a cell battery problem, or a chemical signaling problem in order to choose the right drug or to target therapy for the patient? And the answer is we aren't very good at doing that. We don't have a very good way of being able to sort which drugs will work best for which patient. We have some broad categories that we can make choices from, and partly that has to do with types of seizures. Sometimes there are clues on the EEG that might help us sort into broad categories of seizure drug choices. Sometimes there are things like genetic clues, like the Dravet syndrome gene that Dr. Howard mentioned, where there are certain drugs that we stay away from. That's a sodium channel disease. We don't use drugs that affect the sodium channel. We use other drugs because we know that the sodium channel drugs are not good in those patients, generally speaking. So there are a few things, and it is very, very exciting now in this decade that we have made so many advances in the field of neurology and neurosciences to identify more and more genetic syndromes, because the hope is that we will have more understanding from a pharmacogenomic kind of way to be able to tailor treatments better. And a related question was, there's another medicine question, I don't remember where it is. Basically saying, how do you determine or how do you develop new drugs targeting these things? And quite a lot of the drugs that have been developed, particularly over the last 20 years or so, are very intentionally targeting the cells that are the chemicals that are in synapses, for example, or the channels that are in the cell membranes. And so we try to be smart about that and develop drugs that target things, but then when those drugs come into clinical use, sometimes they aren't as effective as we hope they might be, and sometimes they do different things.
So the other question I have is epilepsy more common in certain parts of the world? So my understanding is that certain, generally speaking, underdeveloped, or what we commonly say third world countries, might have more issues with epilepsy. Some of it is partly due to other disease triggered epilepsy, and also the treatment and the way they deal with epilepsy is not as good as, for instance, United States might deal with a disorder and treatment, but maybe you can say something more about that too. Or, and also, I think the actual cause of epilepsy and why some of these countries might have more of it, I don't think we actually know that very well. So another brain disorder, MS, multiple sclerosis, we know that the epidemiology study shows that the northern hemisphere is more prevalent with MS, and there are some ideas and guesses as why that might be the case, but I don't think that is the case with epilepsy.
So I think that the state of epilepsy care around the world does vary enormously in different countries, and there are still parts of the world where epilepsy is very poorly understood. It's thought to be a curse, it's thought to be possession, and there are lots of people in the world that don't know that it's treatable. So I've actually done some medical mission trips to Kenya over the last 5 years or so, and have had the opportunity to work with kids who have had seizures for years and years and had never had treatment. And it's remarkably eye-opening to see how much of a difference medications make. And in America, there is such great access to medical care, and people come in and they have 2 seizures and we give them medicine, and although not everybody gets controlled, 2/3 of people are controlled on the first or second drug that you try. So it's not that hard, and you go to a place like Kenya where people have had seizures for years and you give them a drug and you can totally alter that life, and it's a really amazing and powerful thing that we really take for granted in our society, that we have access to care.
So I think that actually leads to the next question. How does a family or relative help in reducing the social stigma of epilepsy? And I think it doesn't just apply to epilepsy. I think it applies broadly to any brain disorder, brain disease, or what we might consider mental disorder as well. And my suggestion will be that I think the family members and relatives and friends need to be the advocates, and maybe with just a little, and you guys are obviously here, but a little bit of self-education. I think you guys should be the advocates of the people who are affected by it. And I teach undergraduate students in various psychology classes, and we touch upon various mental disorders. And I often tell my students, you don't hide the fact that you have cancer. And if you say you have cancer, you get certain sympathy, empathy from your social group. But if you say, for example, you have depression or you have OCD, you get different reaction. And but brain disorder isn't any different than having some other physical disease. And I think once we start talking about it that way, I think you can remove the social stigma.
I think we're getting close to running out of time. If maybe we could just do one more round of questions, if we've got some quick ones. Or...
So I'll quickly answer. This is a very quick one. Do you have book recommendations about epilepsy? So there are probably many answers. What I could come up with off the top of my head, the Epilepsy Foundation of America is a great website with lots and lots of patient resources that will have good book recommendations. And the other really excellent resource is the International League Against Epilepsy, which is ILAE. Very, very extensive online resource for epilepsy. But my own personal recommendation for reading, it's not hard science, it's a social science book, but there's a book that's been out about 20 years that's called The Spirit Catches Me and I Fall Down. And that's an amazing book. It's about a family from Laos, I believe, and the little girl has a very severe form of epilepsy, but she is in this culture, the Hmong culture, where epilepsy is not understood and modern medicine is pretty much eschewed. And it's written by one of her treating physicians and about the culture clash of trying to care for that patient. And it's a really, really excellent book that I would recommend to anyone who wants to spend a few weeks reading it. It's long.
So I have one more quick one, which is interesting, and so and I think we could all touch on this. Is are we doing any research or aware of studies on CBD and other types of treatments for epilepsy? So CBD is an oil that is extracted from cannabis, from the plant that makes marijuana. And I know that the FDA recently approved CBD as a treatment. It is for some patients effective. For others, it is not. So like any other anti-epileptic drug, but like any other anti-epileptic drug, we hope that for the patients that it might work for, that it will become more widely available. But you might be able to comment more on that availability.
Yeah, so this could be a huge talk in and of itself. And so there is a drug that will probably come to market soon. It's been approved to be approved, true. Probably the hitching point is going to be that it's still considered a Schedule I controlled substance, which means that the DEA has to reclassify it as something that can be legally prescribed on a federal level. The other thing that probably at least some people in this room know is that the Texas CBD Access Program started this year, and that there are currently 2 functioning dispensaries in Texas and a third one coming online this year that are growing and producing CBD from marijuana plants. And in Texas, it's a very, very different approach from anywhere else in the country because it is only allowed to be used for refractory epilepsy right now. That's the only thing that the law was passed for. And then the other thing, which is also unique and no other state has this kind of a caveat, is that it has to be under the guidance of a physician with a prescription. And no other state requires that. So in other states, you might have a physician say, yes, you can use CBD, which means you're tax exempt, which saves you money. But then they will say, okay, go down the street to that dispensary over there and ask the guy behind the counter what to do, which I find to be concerning, to say the least. Yeah, it is a huge topic of interest. As a physician who treats epilepsy, I wish that CBD was more powerful than it is. I wish that it worked for everyone the way that CNN has broadcast, because there are definitely people who can get a response like that, but they are a small minority of the people who will try it. But if you're that person, then you're really glad that you have it. Yeah.
All right, I really want to thank Dr. Keogh and Dr. Lee for coming out. I really want to thank Alondra and Alma, who really did all the support to make this happen. So, and thank you guys for coming out. We really appreciate it. We love to share our research and our love of the brain with you guys. So thank you very much. And if you have more questions, feel free to come up and chat with me. At least I've got some time.